Can you see my slides, guys?
Yes.
Okay, cool.
Yeah. Okay, so welcome everybody to the second webinar of the National Association for Media Literacy Education, the Students Leadership Council. I'm Jonty Friesem, and we have today Dr. Rebecca Reynolds from Rutgers University. And before we start, I just want to explain what is this webinar. It's a series about research methods that us, the Students Leadership Council, wanted to initiate to help us better understand how we should research media literacy. And our organization, the National Association for Media Literacy Education, is a national membership organization dedicated to expanding the practices of media literacy education around the US and the globe. Our members are K-12 teachers, community-based organizers, youth media organizations, media maker, high ed professors, and high ed students like you. So we're best known for the core principles of media literacy education, our journal of media literacy education, and our biannual conference that this year is going to be in Philadelphia on June 26 and 27. And tomorrow is the deadline to put proposals if you still have time. So for more information, you can go to the website to namely.net. And our hashtag, as you can see here, is namely webinars, if you want to use that. So I'm gonna give now to Rebecca to start our webinar, and thank you for watching. So Rebecca, all yours.
Great, thanks everyone. So you can see me and you can see my slides, right?
No, we can see only the slides.
Okay, I wonder how I do both. Do I want to do both, or how do I?
I don't know if you can do both.
Okay, so let's just do my slides then. Can you see me right now, though?
No, still.
They're just the slides. Okay, so you're just seeing, maybe there's another way. Give me 1 second. I'm just going to see if there's another option, just so you can maybe also
we can
see my.
you.
You can see me now, but not my slides. I can't see a way to have my face in the window, so I'm just going to go with my slides.
Okay.
And so my name is Rebecca Reynolds, but now you've seen my face, and I am an assistant professor at Rutgers University in the field of information science, library and information science. And my research focuses on children's new literacies, the design of technology to encourage learning in a range of different contexts, and I have a background that spans mass communications, sociology, and also my work is also published in the learning sciences and computer-supported collaborative learning disciplines. And so I wanted to share, I mean, I understand, especially if a lot of us on the call today are researchers, I can empathize with anyone who's ever had a challenge in developing their methodologies for investigating media literacy phenomena. Because when I was in graduate school and I was beginning to embark on this journey, it was difficult for me to, find methods that were robust and kind of flexible and adaptable enough to really meet the needs that I had in understanding the effects and the effects of different interventions upon students, but also that figured and factored in the design of the technology environment as well, and or the media curriculum and the sort of educational context. Because we who do media literacy education wear many hats. We may be designers of different program interventions. We may be more sort of focused on research and evaluation. We may be thinking about teacher education and training. We may be thinking about student outcomes and learning. And so there are a lot of different factors that we have to consider when we're doing research involving media literacy education. And I want to share with you today a methodology called DesignBased Research that just an overview on this methodology and give you some, threads and leads on some of your own independent investigation afterwards, because it really helped me in conceptualizing and framing my own research agenda and how to really sort of think about research on media literacy education in a very systematic way. So I wanted to sort of begin with, as Yanti also did, with a sort of reference to namely, because probably one of the things that we all share today is a focus on media literacy education and an interest in this. And so if we look to the namely core principles, we can see that we have some shared principles, regardless of what kind of perspective we may be coming from, at least considering this this organization as an umbrella. And so, we have the first one, which is that the media literacy education requires active inquiry and critical thinking. We want it to expand the concept. We want to expand the concept of literacy to include a range of different forms of media, both reading and writing, and also thinking about technology, obviously, which is coming into play more and more in our work. And so, many of you are probably familiar with these core principles. And so these are sort of some of our shared goals and objectives. But that being said, as Yanti said, we are all coming from different backgrounds, and we may be teachers and educators. We may even be media industry representatives. And so we need a flexible approach that really addresses all of these different perspectives. If you are somebody who is working in the K-12 context, of course, you're probably very interested in specifying learning objectives to your instructional design that relate to the Common Core Standards, and this is just a quick plug for the Namely Common Core Standards crosswalk. There is an educator's guide that links the core principles and media literacy education goals and objectives with the Common Core that's been developed. And so this is a really valuable resource. And so, you may have learning objectives that are sort of grounded and situated in K-12 education and the standards therein, or you may have more sort of broad sort of critical thinking skills, or 21st century skills that if you're working outside of schools that hold different objectives. And so rule one, of course, of instructional design is establishing your learning objectives. Design-based research is a method that can be flexible for a range of different kinds of learning objectives. Another thing we always are wanting to know, sort of regardless of our position, is how do you know it's working? So if you have media literacy education as a goal and you're working towards that, how do you know if this program is working? As a designer, you have to think about this question, especially when you are making ongoing subtle and or dramatic shifts in the curriculum, like from time 1 to time 2, whether it's a semester to a semester, a year to a year. The intervention that you're designing is probably going to be evolving and shifting, especially if you're thinking about the design of this intervention in an iterative way, and you want to be improving upon it. Also, if you've ever implemented a media literacy education project, you know that every class is different, that even if you're working with the same grade level from one time to the next, the dynamics that occur in that classroom are very different. They transform, they change over time, and then from one group to another, you may have a group of students who is very sort of working very well together, they're very compatible, or even within a single class have one team that's like that, and then another team that's very sort of like conflict-ridden. But then in a later semester, perhaps just the dynamic of that group is just completely different. And so how do you know it's working? When class to class, you have to consider these sort of individual level differences. Oftentimes, for the learning interventions that we're designing and these innovations that we're developing, there's no standardized test. There may not be. And so if you're working in a K-12 context and you are connecting to the Common Core, you may very well have a standardized test that is testing knowledge that you're hoping to cultivate in students through a media literacy education intervention, that could be represented by a knowledge test or by a standardized test even. If it's, about climate change and it's a science topic, they may very well be able to, reflect that in, a science knowledge test, or obviously there's no existing Common Core science test yet, I believe, in most states, but, an English test, for instance, might have a standardized test as an outcome that you could test, but there may not be those standardized tests, and so how do you know it's working then? So these are a range of different sort of considerations that play into our media literacy education development. So design-based research is a method that emerged in the growing field of the learning sciences, and it has sort of hit the journals and the research literature around the early 2000s, and the late 1990s. And so in 2003 and 2004, the journal's educational researcher and educational psychologist, two of the most the highest impact factor journals in the field, dedicated entire volumes to the topic of design-based research, and they're calling it an emerging paradigm for educational inquiry. So this is a method that really acknowledges the need for research-driven innovation in the design of new learning technologies, especially those involving technology, learning environments. And so whether you're talking about the development of a curriculum or the development of a technology-based environment, or the development of any kind of technological representation, the way that it's identified and described in design-based research is it's called an innovation. That's a broad term, whether it's the curriculum, whether it's the technology. We're calling this thing that we're analyzing the innovation. And so that's a term that you're going to hear used throughout this talk. And that's what I'm referring to. It can refer to both the curriculum and the technology environments that we're thinking about, and the media-based environments that we're designing and developing to support the student learning and even using in our media literacy education. So this is a method that takes into account, the need for some shifts in our research methodology because we have all of these new innovations. And it also acknowledges the difficulty that emerges in identifying the causes and in identifying causes and measuring outcomes of learning interactions using traditional social science methods, such as the controlled experiment. So some of you may have, thesis advisors and mentors who encourage the use of experimental methods, and certainly there's a lot of educational research that exists supporting the controlled experiment. It's still considered the gold standard by a lot of policy organizations. But design-based research sort of takes a different perspective, and perhaps even a little bit of a critical perspective towards the controlled experiment, at least in an educational context. And the reason for that is that it links back to some of those, challenges that I mentioned earlier around all of the variation that exists in education settings from one setting to the next. So Barab and Squire in 2004 published an article that identified, that really described the design-based research method, and it's one that I'll recommend that you look to. And they point out a number of the differences between the psychological experimentation model and design-based research. And so some of the differences that they identify are that, typically psychological experimentation occurs in lab settings, frequently involves a single or a couple of dependent variables, and its attempt to control the experiment to just reflect just a couple of factors. It focuses on identifying a few variables, holding them constant, using fixed procedures, isolates learners to control interaction. It focuses on testing hypotheses, and it treats participants as subjects. And so these are all of the different categories, of difference that they're identifying. And so, you can think about that in the context of a classroom, where isolating just a couple of variables may not make that experiment very naturalistic to what is actually going on every day to day in a classroom. And so findings that emerge out of a random control trial experiment that occurs across a year, for instance, in a classroom, it's not taking into account a lot of the phenomena that's occurring. And so we have to sort of question the validity of some of those methods that are used. And so Design-based research offers an alternative, and it's especially useful given the rapid evolution that's occurring in the field of education. And it considers the question of innovation and the development of new learning technologies. And so in this method, the authors point out that it occurs in the buzzing, blooming confusion of real-life settings where most learning actually occurs, and that it involves multiple dependent variables, focuses on characterizing the situation for its complexity, much of which is not now a priori, which means basically we can't know it yet. It sort of is emergent and it happens in situ. It addresses flexible design revision and involves complex social interactions. It involves looking at multiple aspects of the design and developing a profile that characterizes the design in practice. And it involves different participants in the design so that you're bringing differing expertise into producing it and analyzing. So you can imagine, for the trade-offs and benefits of design-based research, it's very challenging. There's a lot that you have to do. What often happens is that an advanced, experienced researcher who understands the design-based research method will team up with an educator, a forward-thinking, pioneering educator who wants to do something innovative. And that researcher will work very closely with the educator across time in order to implement a research study. And the idea is that instead of doing a random controlled trial experiment with 200 schools where you have a pre and a post, but you don't capture any of the variation that occurs during the context of the innovation. Instead, you're working with usually smaller N projects where you might have a few schools, and you're working closely with the educator. You're designing an innovation that gets implemented, and then you're really closely watching and evaluating how that innovation unfolds. You obviously are going to be specifying everything very closely up front. So you're going to have your learning objectives, you're going to have your instructional design, you're going to have all of the different checks and balances in place that are meant to occur throughout the process. And then you're going to have your evaluation at the end. But in the context of this, design-based research allows for iterative change on the fly. And another major value of design-based research is that it's theoretically driven instructional design. And I'm just going to take a quick moment because I have been talking a lot. Everyone is still there. Everyone can still hear me. Is that correct? Okay, just checking in. Good. So, so in this method, you specify a theoretical perspective up front, and your design is done with the theory in mind. So you're working from a theoretically driven instructional design. But if you're a true hardcore design-based researcher, which not everyone has to be, but if you are doing this research with the goal of sharing your findings in the community of scholarship that has emerged out of this kind of research, which is the learning sciences, then you are conducting this work with an aim of improving learning theory, improving our understanding of learning and our explanation of learning theoretical perspective. You're also doing this with a goal of improving instructional design and instructional theory. So learning theory is the most abstract you can get. Instructional theory and instructional design are a closer level of applied sort of work, but it's still generalizable. So you're coming up with theoretical principles and pragmatic best practices that others may be able to apply in their work. And then you're also, of course, thinking about those kids you're actually testing this with. You want to improve their experience day to day in this actual project that's occurring then and there. And so you're very close to this project, and you're working with a teacher. You're making close observations. Now, obviously, you're going to have research questions that are driving this work. You don't just sort of like design it, set it up, deploy it and, sort of show up and just observe. Like, you're looking for something specific. You may want to have a question like, does this particular feature or functionality work in the way that it's meant to of the innovation? And so, like, you may be zeroing in on one very specific minute facet of the design of this innovation. You may have a broader learning objective or research question driving this work. But again, this is usually theoretically driven and linked to the learning sciences literature, like questions that are emerging in this. And so I recommend, suggest to anyone who's interested in this method to look to the communities of the learning sciences where a lot of interesting research is being done on technology innovations especially. They may not call it media literacy education, but there are a lot of associations between the work that's happening, especially around educational technology in the learning sciences, and this media literacy education work that we're doing. Another subdiscipline is called computer-supported collaborative learning. So these are some of the benefits of design-based research in that they allow you to think very pragmatically, on the one hand, about the actual intervention that you're designing, developing, deploying in this local setting, but it also asks you to think about the generalizable principles that are emerging from this and how they can inform your own ongoing work, but also help the larger, media literacy education community and learning sciences community learn how to, more broadly apply the improvements that you yourself identify in the project that you're running, and share those along and develop a greater level of best practices. So hopefully with some of that as a backdrop, you can kind of see how design-based research plays into iterative program design, program evaluation, and it may not be quite as clear yet how design-based research can contribute to what we know about student assessment and evaluation. I may take a break, and since we have just a few people on the call at this point, does anyone have any questions so far?
Hi, this is Elizaveta. I have a question. Well, first of all, thank you very much for the great introduction. I was wondering if you could give an example, like describe a small project where this research, design-based research is applied and how it works out.
Absolutely, and that's actually where my presentation is heading, so that's a perfect segue. Yeah, I'm going to talk about how I use this method in the Global Laurea game design project that I study. So maybe I'll table that question for now because that's where I'm moving, and see. Hopefully, I'll be able to address that in the next couple of slides. Would anyone else like to bring anything else up that you're curious about from the intro so far?
You mentioned really quickly issues of validity, and that's something that I'm struggling very much with my own research. Mm-hmm. And that was something that I wanted to know if you can elaborate more why, from your point of view, design-based research, and especially with media literacy, because that's our focus, would be more valid than the positivist or even post-positivist research of quantitative experimental research.
Sure. So I am not at all proposing that that positivist research and that random controlled trial experimentation is not valid, but it's all a question of context. And when we are in, every intervention exists at a different stage of development, and so if you're working on a project that really truly is an innovation that's new, that we don't know that much about yet, or that reflects design principles that have been less frequently tested and are not, don't have a strong evidence base yet, then your work can be considered quite formative still. And so the more summative methods in random control trials are not necessarily appropriate to use yet. So you may want a method that's more flexible that allows you to consider like micro improvements and micro enhancements across time with a smaller N population so that you actually can look at things and observe them at a much closer level of analysis. Because, you know, if you are doing a random control trial experiment, you're controlling for a range of different factors. You're only looking at a couple of variables, and you're wanting to see if the intervention, you know, is effective or not. And so, you know, I mean, if you're testing a traditional curriculum that involves a textbook and material within a textbook, you know, oftentimes what would occur is that, you know, using all of the rigorous experimental methods, a certain textbook would be implemented in a classroom in a very uniform way across like a semester, for instance, and a set of, you know, some students would receive that intervention, other students would receive a different textbook or nothing, or, you know, something else that was the control group, and you would look at the differences in the larger and, you know, data set. But in the case of an innovation involving technology or a media literacy education type intervention, we're still trying to figure out, like, all of the complexities of what kinds of features and functionalities are, you know, like, even operable on a day-to-day basis with students. There's a lot of, like, close-grain analysis that's still needed. So, you know, like, if you think about things across an 8-week time frame, say you're implementing a media literacy education project, and you're considering, like, at what week out of the 8 weeks it might be best to introduce some kind of a text or some kind of an activity. You may want to test it, you know, in like one class or half a class at week 2, another half of the class at week 5, and which, you know, think and consider, like, which group that you're seeing a better result with. And you may not need an experiment for that, and you may not need 5,000 students for that. You know, these are a lot of sort of beta testing type questions that can be done on a more micro level of analysis and can result in important refinements in the design of the intervention that don't require giant data sets. Okay, so like in, if you have an intervention that, if you and I have an intervention that shares learning objectives, but you have a very different way of arriving at those learning objectives in your students, and we are interested in, like, students at the same grade level, then, you know, you and I could work for however many years are needed to, like, really refine and develop our own, you know, different kinds of innovations to arrive at these common learning objectives, and then use a random control trial experiment to compare which has the better outcome. But that's only after you've done all of that work to get the intervention at the level of sort of, you know, professionalism and readiness to be able to, like, be ready to test that. Is that sensible?
So would that be correct to say, according to what I heard you just saying, that design-based research is good for exploring some kind of an experience or a phenomena that you want to explore, but then you do have the theory in mind, as you said, so that's not grounded theory, and it's not phenomenology because it's more structured and as, like, with you and the actual person who implement this intervention.
Yeah, it's a very pragmatic approach, but in a way it is phenomenological, and in a way it is also grounded, because you do start with a set of objectives up front and a design, but the point is, you know, you want to offer the best experience for those kids who are the actual subjects of this very, you know, immediate intervention that you're doing in this particular, you know, go-round. And so if you see something that's glaringly not working, you can even change it then and there in the same, you know, implementation, but you note it as a change, and the iterative changes that you make to the intervention are actually a unit of analysis. Like, here's a sort of another way to think about this. Like in random control trial experiments, the individual is the unit of analysis, whereas in design-based research, both the individual student and the innovation are units of analysis. So I hope that at least somewhat helps you think about that. And maybe as I sort of talk about the example, it'll sort of become a little bit more clear. Anyone else? Okay, I'm going to move into that. Start sharing my screen again. Can you see it?
No.
Not sharing. I took the risk and came back to my face. Let's see.
Maybe there are different kind of windows that are open, but it should be the green.
Okay. I'm sorry, give me 1 second.
Yeah.
What do you see under showcase? Do you see anything?
Showcase?
No.
Oh, I didn't.
Nothing changed
No,
for
it should be on screen share, the green one with the.
Shoot. What if I turn my camera off? No. Sorry, guys, it's not letting my screen share again. Shoot.
Nope.
I'm sorry. Do you want to re-invite me? Is that too dangerous?
Yeah, I think so.
I mean, I can speak to my slides in the background, but it would be way nicer if you could see them. Let me see.
Yeah.
Settings.
You want to try to send them to me, and
Oh yeah, that's a good idea.
I'll try to share the screen. What happened is that when you do the green one, the share screen, then you have a small screen that pops up and asks you which kind of screen do you want to share.
I know, and I'm not getting that message.
So maybe, I don't know, maybe you have too many windows.
Hold on. Wait, maybe I got it now. Okay, hold on. Sorry, guys.
No.
Okay, good.
Okay, here we go.
Sorry. All right.
Okay.
So, as I said, the design-based research method is implemented upon projects in which there's a theoretical perspective influencing the design. And so in the case of the Global Laurea project, which is the project that I've been investigating for several years, constructionism is the theoretical framework, which has also been called a framework for action that informs the design of Global Laurea. And Dr. Edith Harel, out of the Worldwide Workshop and the Global Laurea Project, the co-founder of this, was instrumental in the early phases of constructionism, its development at MIT Media Lab. She co-wrote some of the seminal texts on this with Seymour Papert in the late 80s and early 90s, and conducted her own dissertation employing this perspective in the context of an intervention with 4th, 5th, and 6th graders who used the Logo programming language to develop games about fractions. And so there was a connection to the K-12 standard curriculum in mathematics. And so the students would design and develop these games, and she found that there were significant benefits to their learning. And so she took that approach and has been using it in the context of research and development around web services since that time. And so she has been working in the Web 1.0 context in the 90s and into the early 2000s, and then has transformed her initiatives into much more social media-based, current day web technologies. And so her current project is called the Global Lawyer Program, and in this program, what was a nonprofit and is now, I believe her organization is commercializing. They have developed a whole game design curriculum and a proprietary learning management system and e-learning platform that allows schools and other kinds of educational institutions to offer game design classes to students, predominantly in middle school and high school, in which they spend a lot of time on task to design and develop games using this really advanced and comprehensive curriculum that is presented to them in the learning management system environment. And this learning management system has been developed on a wiki-based platform, and they offer all different kinds of information and tutorials and resources for students and teachers to use as they're implementing this opportunity to students to learn game design. And so right now the program is occurring in a range of different states. It's happening in California, Texas, Florida, West Virginia, in New York, and they've actually expanded into a number of other states, including Alabama, Wyoming. They're in a number of different places right now, so this is a little bit of an older map. And so this is a quick picture of the learning management system environment. Every school gets their own dedicated platform, and the kids are learning game design. And so a lot of the media literacy education tenets that we all share are represented in this project because the kids are creating, designing, engaging in inquiry-based learning, and becoming critical consumers of technology through making activity. And they also, when they're designing the games, they go online and do informational research on the broader internet, even outside of the context of this platform, and they use information resources to support the message that gets built into the game. So they design the game, and then they build, a message they express some kind of a message and narrative in the game that is of their own development. And so in some cases, it is linked to the core curriculum. So it might be a game about climate change, it might be a game about science, math, an English language learning game, that kind of thing. But it also may be something that's driven by their own interest. And so in some locations, the students are creating games about social justice issues, issues that are broader to the community, and they may very well be using media resources to design the game, and to develop their message. And so, as you can see, there are a lot of skills that are involved here. The program offers students the chance to develop constructionist digital literacy, which I have an article describing, and we have a model of 6 contemporary learning abilities that are the learning objectives for the program, which actually are listed here. And all of this has gone into, so these are the learning objectives, and the program has been designed to cultivate these objectives in the students. And so students are meant to develop the ability to invent, work through, and complete an original digital artifact, to manage a project online in a wiki-based network environment, and so manage the project development in this context. And they are creating digital media using a range of different social tools online. They are, and they're sharing and developing using the learning management system to archive, share, and sort of more broadly publish their work. They're using those social-based tools. They're using information as a learning tool, and they're also serving websites. If their program happens to be linked to the core curriculum, they're also meant to gain a deeper level of knowledge in the core subject matter, STEM career interests, and then similar to Harrell's original work in constructionism, there are a range of other sort of 21st century skills dimensions, and those would be more sort of affective, motivational improvements in the students as a result. So those are some of the objectives, and the program is then designed using the constructionist framework as an influence, theoretically. And so my research has been conducted under a design-based research framework, and so my goal is to help the organization as a consulting researcher to identify, areas that may need improvement, to identify new ways of evaluating students and their learning outcomes, and to, generally speaking, offer a lens and perspective on, program evaluation for this new innovation. And so you may question, okay, well, what is the innovation in this context? That's the question that I sometimes hear. And so the thing that the organization has designed from an instructional design perspective is the learning management system platform. They've also developed the curriculum, which is the scope and sequence for the game design. So there's a couple of different dimensions of the instructional design. It's this learning management system platform, and it's the curriculum scope and sequence, how it's mapped across time, what kinds of activities they are offering at what time frames, and that kind of thing. And so the kind of research that I've been conducting with them is under the design-based research paradigm. And I want to mention that all of the literature on design-based research encourages a mixed methods approach. So under design-based research, you could be choosing an eclectic range of different sort of sub-methodologies to support this goal of program refinement. So I use participant observation. I go in and I videotape classrooms, and I audio tape their discussion, and I consider what I'm seeing on the camera in terms of their teamwork dynamics, how they're talking about their work. I also use, I do content analysis of the actual learning management system and the content that gets posted there by the students, and I look at that and I think about it in relation to maybe what I'm seeing in the classroom. I use pre- and post-test surveys. And then the two kind of new and exciting areas of data collection that I'm working on are, one of them is the analysis of the trace logs from the web services that the students are using. So the program has, I think, over 3,000 students who are currently involved all over the country. And so I obviously can't come anywhere close to following all of those students, especially from a qualitative perspective. But when they're using the learning management system, the trace logs get generated. And in the Wiki learning management system, all of that data can be extracted and analyzed using different sort of like big data analysis methods, and that I'm working on right now with a couple of collaborators. And so we use the trace data to look at student behaviors across time on different areas of the site. So like we look at their page edits, we look at the file uploads that they post, and we think about them in terms of frequency, in terms of how they reflect student interactions within different teams, and processes across time. So like when someone is more and less active. And moving forward, we're hoping that some of this data can give us insight into success and failure trajectories, and so we can understand, if we look at it in relation, like patterns of behavior across time in relation to outcomes, we may be able to know something about what kind of processes lead to successful outcomes versus not as successful, and then be able to develop develop algorithms that help the educators diagnose this earlier on, so that they can intervene if the student is on a less successful behavioral trajectory, at least according to what the actual system trace logs are telling us. So that's one exciting area that I'm working on. And then the other data source is the actual games. So the students are creating these games, and in media literacy education projects, anyone who also has, implemented an MLE probably has involved the student in some kind of creative output, whether it is, even if it's as simple as some kind of a written report. That's an artifact of their knowledge gain. Usually it's something like a multimedia project or something, maybe more dynamic using different media modalities, and in this case it's a game. And so, we look at the games I've developed coming out of mass communications. One of my training backgrounds is in that field, and I adapted the content analysis method to evaluate the student games. So thinking about how content analysis is used on media content, you can apply it also to the media content of a game. And so I developed a rubric, basically a coding scheme that measures different qualities of games. And ultimately, when we're talking about an educational project like this is a knowledge outcome. This is what the students were able to learn through the program. And so that's something that others in media literacy education may want to employ as a method as well when they are looking at wanting some kind of an outcome metric. It doesn't have to be like a proxy-based survey or a knowledge test, which is a little bit remote from the actual performative activity they're doing. It can actually be the artifact themselves that they created right in that activity and project. That's the knowledge outcome. Those are some of the sort of sub-methodologies within design-based research that I've used, and I have a number of studies that I've published that report upon these findings. And the disciplines where I'm sort of directing my publications include information science at this point, because I'm now employed in a school of library and information science, so obviously I'm thinking towards my fit within this discipline. And so some of my research has gone in the direction of student information seeking in guided inquiry-based learning projects like this. So like, how does their development of a message in the game and their online research that they have to do in order to create the message, how is that playing out, and how does it relate to the overall program design? So that's one of the key areas of my research at the moment. And so some of my qualitative research findings on that indicate that, interestingly, I've described this pretty complex project that the students are engaged in, and their primary task is game design. So they're designing and developing this game, and they're learning computer programming, and they're designing this game in Flash. So it's a software program. It's a standalone software program on their computer, but they're using all these web services to support it. And so this primary task of programming in a game is very well supported by the instructional design. And interestingly, what I'm seeing is that what I'm calling secondary tasks, which are their collaboration process and their inquiry activity, these are actually discrete processes in and of themselves that students don't have much experience with. A lot of students, especially in K-12, middle school and high school, when you put them in teams, haven't had limited experience in teamwork. And they also, even though we like to say that kids are digital natives and they know a lot about using technology, we know that their information seeking skills are rather limited, and their information literacy really needs a lot more support. So one thing I've seen is that the way this program has been designed is it almost presumes collaborative skills, and it presumes inquiry information seeking skills. There are a couple of, sort of supports that are present for those two activities, but my research is suggesting that maybe there's a need for greater support for information seeking and for collaboration in support of this primary game design task. So that's how design-based research is playing into like this broader research agenda. And so like one recommendation I can make is, okay, well, how can I help, all of the amazing people who have developed this project maybe develop some further supports for information seeking in particular, since I'm coming out of information literacy and the School of Information Science. And so I'm hoping to get some funding to maybe develop some information seeking scaffolds that can help support this side of the maker activity. And I also have a new study. I'll just say it really quick, and then I'm going to open it up to questions. I have a new study that has indicated that it's really exciting work that that student participation in Global Laureate is actually attenuating their the digital divide effects. So a lot of research is telling us that race, gender, and ethnicity predict digital literacy. This is in sort of cross-sectional research of the general population. And so what we did was me and my collaborator Mingming Chu looked at whether these relationships do exist within the population of kids who are participating in Global Laureate that we have in our data set. And so prior to participating, it was the case that these digital divide correlations were present, just as expected, and as they have been mirrored in other past studies. So the question was, okay, well, if they participate in Global Laureate, what happens? Like, do they still have those? Is the digital divide issue still present in the students after they participate? Because if so, the program is not meeting some of its objectives. And so it was exciting research findings because we were able to use multi-level analysis and look at the ways that these relationships shift as a result of student participation. And we found that in the students we tested in a large sample, the race and gender, actually the gender effects were eliminated altogether. So where girls were less likely to have digital literacy or had lower levels of digital literacy than boys prior to, after participating, there was no gender effect. And the results for socioeconomic status, which is measured by parent education in students this young, also indicated that the results were attenuated. They were not eliminated, but the gap narrowed significantly for socioeconomic status in the outcomes we measured. And then for race and ethnicity, we had a limited sample because a lot of for the 2012-2013 school year, we derived this data from the state of West Virginia, which has a more uniform, homogeneous population than other states. The sample was less diverse, but we did even see an effect for Hispanics in this population around the capital city, that we did have enough Hispanic students in the data set to show an effect in which the results were eliminated for Hispanic students, where there was a relationship prior to and no relationship after. So these are exciting findings also in the digital divide, showing that programs like this can really make a difference. And if they're offered more broadly, we might see significant effects in the general population if we can do these things more often in school. Okay, so I'm going to leave it there. I'm going to turn off my screen share and then open it up to the questions of the couple people we have on the phone now. On the phone, I say on the phone, on the web conference.
So thank you. That's really very interesting to look at that, and I can really see how it applies to research that I'm doing now and interested in. Now, but the big question that I had while listening to it was, I'm using multiple case study, like mixed methods. And I was wondering, because it sounds, you're using qualitative, quantitative, you're in different settings, but you're looking in a holistic way, as you said, the learners, but also the intervention itself. And I feel that things that I'm doing with multiple case studies are very similar. So I was wondering if there is any difference, or it's a terminology, and where is the difference between those two methods?
Well, I like design-based research because it's situated in a history of methodological development in the field of education, and it's also situated in this sort of growing subfield of the learning sciences. And so there's a lot of, like, if you're just talking about, I mean, say you're writing a dissertation and you're writing about the case study methodology, case study is not necessarily like at all specific to education, and it may not take into account like some of the contingencies that are present in the field of education. And something that's nice about design-based research is that it emerged out of the education context and all of the sort of like opportunities and challenges that are present in those kinds of environments. So it can add, so I think case study, I mean, when I wrote my dissertation, I had to talk about all of the sub-methods that I used underneath the design-based research framework, certainly. And I think the DBR, it's called a methodological paradigm, and so it's sort of broader than like a case study method or, you know, something like maybe participant observation or something like that. And you may describe that, you know, within the umbrella of the larger framework.
Okay.
Or the more, I wouldn't even necessarily call it a larger framework, but the education-specific framework.
So we have like 2 more minutes. I don't know if Zoe or Elisaveta, you want to ask any question? Or do you have any question to Rebecca?
Thank you, Rebecca. It was very interesting. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Yes.
Oh, sorry. I'm sorry. I don't know if this is off topic, but I'm interested in the digital inequality that you talk about. Have you ever? I mean, of course, you've done research about the gender divide and ethnicity divide. Is there any research about like cultural divide, like internationally divided digital inequality?
Yes, there's a very large corpus of research on the digital divide, and a lot of people have looked at this from a range of different sort of perspectives internationally, for anywhere from like access to use to. So I mean, if you're talking about access, you're talking about questions of like broadband and infrastructure and availability of some of these technologies in and of themselves to populations worldwide. And then, there's digital, the digital divide is talked about in two sort of ways. It's talked about in terms of access, and then it's talked about in terms of digital literacy. So there's the access, there's the skills, and then, there are policy implications and perspectives on this. So like how governments are, playing into, so like for instance, the National Broadband Plan of 2010 in the US was an FCC kind of blueprint for the Federal Communications Commission framework and blueprint for reaching the sort of whatever X percent, something like, I don't know, I think it's maybe 27% of the population who don't use the internet. And one of those questions is the reach of broadband and into, for instance, rural communities and more remote regions. So like there's those angles from an access perspective. But then, there are all different kinds of ways of looking at technology adoption and use. And so there are, actually in the paper that I wrote, I'm happy to send it to you if you'd like. I offer a, what could even be seen as a rather brief lit review on some of these, digital divide literatures. And so there's a couple of theoretical frameworks that get at this. And Barzilai Nahon is a scholar who has given a nice comprehensive framework. I believe it's Barzilai Nahon 2006 has given a really comprehensive, analysis of the literature internationally and made some really good recommendations on, work moving forward.
Thank you.
Sure.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, so I think we're gonna wrap it up. We're like more than an hour.
Great. Thank
So
you,
again,
everyone.
thank you
Yes.
so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And,
And I'm happy to make my slides available, and if anyone wants a preprint of this article on the digital divide, I would be more than pleased to share it. Just send me an
Great.
email. And I'm at rebecca.reynolds@rutgers.edu.
So again, thank you so much, everybody, and especially you, Rebecca, for coming and talking with us about research method, which is something in media literacy that we're not talking enough. And I feel that this series of webinar is a way to kind of have the discussion broader and involve more people. So thank you for spending this evening with us.
Thank you for the
And,
opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you for
Sure.
hosting.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Okay, so thank you.
Signing off.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye. Good night.